A second point that needs to be made here is that when one's talking about probabilities, then you've also got to consider on the other side of the scale, what is the probability that God does exist? And here I would offer multiple considerations that I think make it quite probable that there is, in fact, a transcendent creator and designer of the universe, despite any improbability that the suffering in the world might throw upon the existence of God.
Well, now, I feel like Dr. Craig has kind of moved the goalposts a little bit here, because transcendent, creator being is not exactly the full definition of the Christian God. Now, whether that is a transcendent being that transcends reality, or just some, deity that exists out there. Hell, it could even be a theistic deity where it's a personal interaction between the believer and the God. Just because there's a personal interaction, or there's this transcendent factor in God, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's described as being omnibenevolent. The only way that the problem of evil should be used is when you're arguing against an omnibenevolent definition. And I guess specifically, this omnibenevolent God would also have to be all-knowing in order for the problem of evil to really hold water against it. It's a very niche sort of argument here, which definitely can be used against Abrahamic religions, because their God is defined as omnibenevolent, all-knowing, all-powerful, all those omni attributes. And so with all those attributes and evil exists, sure, that God does not exist. But if you're just talking about some transcendent God that, may or may not be omnibenevolent, if you're not defining that trait, then the problem of evil is really not going to affect whether or not that God exists. So I feel like Dr. Craig has sort of shifted the goalposts here in what he's actually talking about, because he's no longer talking about specifically the Abrahamic God or the Christian God. He's more broadly talking about a general transcendent creator being, which there are plenty of those that exist in other religions that don't include omnibenevolent gods.
Interestingly, I've never forgotten the story, a true story, about a young university student in Scotland, not long after, well, probably, I suspect, during the Depression years. Things were grim. And he knocked on the door. It was open, of a small cottage that was opened. There was a returned serviceman from the First World War. And when he realized the young man wanted to talk to him about God, he said, "Go away." He said, "I was in the trenches in France, and I stopped believing in God when I saw all that evil." And the young man said to him, "I respect that must have been terrible, and I certainly won't pest you, but can I just make the observation that I wonder if I'd been there, I might not have stopped believing in man rather than stopped believing in God."
Well, why would you stop believing in man? I mean, I guess it's a bit of an equivocation here, because believing in man versus believing in God are two totally different things. Because believing in man, I feel like that has the connotation of believing in the goodness of men, believing in that people will choose to do the right thing over the wrong thing. And I definitely don't believe in my fellow man like that. Now, individuals, sure, there are a few individuals that I feel would, choose to do the right thing over the wrong thing. And I try to keep those people close to me. But as far as like comparing that to believing in God, I don't think so. It's not the same thing, because saying that you don't believe in God because there's this evil that exists in the world and you don't know how to make heads or tails of it, because if this God is omnibenevolent, like I've been taught all of my life, then why is he allowing kids to have bone cancer? Why is he allowing the Nazis to kill my friend over here in the trench? Or in World War I, it was still the Germans that were fighting, the other side. But still, you get my point here, is that not believing in a God, because you find all of these unnecessary things that happen in our reality, but yet they still happen. They cause suffering. They are considered evil. And God just sits back in his lazy boy and he watches it and he masturbates. I think that's a totally legit reason not to believe in God. But I do want to offer a counter example to the host's example here of being in the trenches, knocking on the door and everything like that. And that's this quote from Primo Levi, an Auschwitz survivor. And he said, "There is Auschwitz, and so there cannot be God." And in that picture that I showed, that was actually a meme, a picture that I created for a Facebook page long ago. But those are just piles of eyeglasses from all of the people that were killed at Auschwitz. The fact that that unnecessary suffering happened that evil happened and God did nothing whatsoever to save his chosen people, which that's not the first time it's happened either. It's happened multiple times in the Old Testament of God seemingly abandoning his chosen people, or even hiring mercenaries basically to come in and enslave his chosen people just because they were worshiping other gods, or they allowed other people to worship gods within their own cities and everything. I feel like that is definitely not an omnibenevolent God.
Yeah.
And the old man looked at him, tears welled up in his eyes, and he said, "You better come in. We need to talk about this."
Yeah.
It's an interesting take on evil. I sometimes think that one of our problems is that we're not self-reflective enough about
Yes,
our own nature and our own
certainly
flawed.
one of the major developments in philosophy with respect to this problem is the so-called free will defense, in which philosophers, I think, have been able to show that it's neither improbable nor impossible that every world that God would create that would involve this much good, this much moral goodness, would also involve this much moral evil freely perpetrated by human free agents. So that
now, on a naturalistic worldview, I agree. These kind of evils or suffering, they exist just because they do exist. Now, I'm not so much buying into the whole idea that like, oh, well, this good exists, therefore this evil must exist. I don't think that that particular statement holds a lot of water, because I don't see as, oh, well, good things exist, therefore bad things also have to exist. I feel like good things could exist, and that's mutually exclusive from bad things existing. Of course, this is all talking about the subjective view of classifying good and bad things. You could argue that then, if all this unnecessary suffering was out of the picture, that didn't happen, then all of the things that were good would then be further broken down into, well, this is good over here, and now we're considering this to be bad or evil or something like that. So maybe I could see a perpetual like classification, but I mean, still, that's all in our own heads. That's all subjectively done by us. It's not like this is some God that's causing evil or anything like that, because it's just nature. In nature, everything's amoral. Well, nature's amoral, and it doesn't care about the suffering of conscious creatures or things that we would call evil in this world. Nature is just there. Under the idea of an omnibenevolent God, though, that with this magical power to influence the actions of people or influence what happens in this world or create things at the drop of a hat, I don't think that it makes a lot of sense. Do you?
ultimately, the blame lies at man's threshold and not at God's.
As far as classifying things as good and bad, evil, and everything like that, I would agree that it's up to us to classify those things. Somebody could see something as bad or suffering, and that same suffering or evil could be seen as neutral or maybe even good to somebody else. So this classification of good and bad and evil is really subjective. Now, as far as suffering goes, I feel like we can concretely define suffering and in a way that's objective. And so I don't think that you can just get away with saying, oh, ultimately it's up to man, or it's man's responsibility and how we perceive things. Of course, that's not what Dr. Craig's talking about. What Dr. Craig's talking about is that it's our own free will that creates all this evil, because God is so loving, he allows us to have free will. And so that means that some people are just going to do evil things. But if God really is all powerful and all knowing, then don't you think that he would create people or make it so that people just didn't cause those pieces of unnecessary suffering? But even so, the pieces of unnecessary suffering that I've brought up today are things that are not necessarily caused by people. These are things that are unnecessary and uncaused by others, like children having bone cancer or having some kind of genetic disease or something like that. There's nobody that is to blame for that because it's just there. Well, barring the nuances of, anything that does cause those things, I'm just talking about them just happening in general, not because of some chemical that was in the water or something like that. You understand what I'm saying?